Yes, thank you. I'll start over. Thank you everyone for coming. It's great to see you all here, and we hope we have a great time and enjoy this conference that we prepared the best we could. And if you haven't met me before, my name is Daniela Vasco, and I'm the chair of the Early Career and Student Statisticians at the Statistical Society of Australia. And we are very excited to have you here. And I'd like to start, let me just share my screen. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we all acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout the world. We acknowledge that there are more people from outside of Australia here and their connections to land, sea, and community. And we pay our respect to the elders, past and present, and extend the respect to all First Nations peoples today. And I pay particular respect to the people from Turrbal and Jagera lands here in Brisbane. And if you want, feel free to type into the chat as well from which country you are meeting us, and the state if you're in Australia, and if you are in another country as well, so we know from where you're joining us today. And I'd like to thank, firstly, the organizing committee for this conference. Without them, we couldn't have had this conference today, and all the chairs and keynote speakers, and some are giving the workshop as well, and everyone who contributed for the success or for us meeting today, and also our sponsors who very generously have contributed so we can put together this conference. And I would like to let you know that we have a code of conduct for this conference, and we expect for every participant to feel safe in this environment and welcome and be treated with dignity and respect. And we have details on the code of conduct in Slack as well, but basically we want everyone to treat each other as they would like to be treated themselves. And this should be done in the time that we are here on Zoom, but also on social media. Every time we post anything related to this conference, we had to abide by this code of conduct. And there is a channel in Slack with all the details on that. And some housekeeping now. So we are using Slack, as I mentioned before, instead of chat on Zoom. So all the questions will be asked in Slack. And there are several channels there. So we have one for this workshop, which is workshop Risky Statistical Business, where you can ask the questions and the discussions, everything will happen there. Then we have the main hall where the Zoom link will be posted every morning. And also we can ask questions about each presentation in that chat, in the thread where that presentation is identified. We also have a chat social channel where you can just chat with each other. We have a share information and collaborate channel where you can share information, and if you are presenting your work and you have published, you can put there your paper. If you have published something related with someone else's presentation, you can put your paper up as well and tag them there. So it's a space with a more formal discussion on collaboration. We also have the bios from the keynotes and panelists, and we also post there the slides from in this channel here, the slides from the keynotes. We have a channel for upcoming events where we post some events that will come up during this week and in the next week from the Statistics Society of Australia and our partners as well. And today we have an event from the Victoria branch, so check that out in the evening. And we also have the conference program. If you need to check which session is coming next, well, should I go to that one and hope we go to all of them? We can check the program just here. And as I said, we have the code of conduct. And we'll be recording the conference. If you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your camera. But if you don't mind, and if you want to turn your camera, feel free to do so, and also to turn on your mic if you want to ask any questions, things like that. And the Slack will be on for 90 days, but after that, everything will be deleted. So if you have posted something in the collaboration channel, for example, so it's good to save the papers or something, some information that is there. So download before that time is up. Otherwise, that information will be missed. So I'll stop sharing my screen. not sure if there is any questions from this information right now, or how the Slack. So good. So yes, so I'll just quickly introduce Associate Professor Samantha Lochoy, who is giving us the workshop today on risky statistical business, and she has extended more than 30 years experience actually in statistical advising and consulting. And she had worked in different sectors in government, academia, and has worked with people from different areas of research and from different backgrounds as well. And now she works at Griffith University as a senior statistician across all schools and academic groups at Griffith. So she is used to work with people from different expertise, from different areas of research as well. And her expertise is in expert elicitation in the Bayesian statistics. And she uses also that into her advising skills. So it's a pleasure to have her, and I have learned from her for the time that we've been working together as well at Griffith, and I'm sure you learn as well. So and thank you so much, Sama, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Daniela. Yes, so today's workshop I gave the title as being Risky Statistical Business. I've been lucky enough to work with emerging research methods advisors. So these are people who might be sitting in a business unit and helping the people around them with their stats, or there's a few of us appointed across the university to help people across the area. That's a role I've had in other universities as well. So after moving to Griffith, though, I guess it's got a very decentralized kind of arrangement. And so I'm more training people up who work in their own areas. So it's not a centralized stats advising approach at Griffith, it's more decentralized. So people are embedded within their area, but talk to each other across, come together as research methods advisors with a common goal. So this workshop comes out of some experiences I've had at Griffith in trying to train people in the business of doing statistical advising. So this involves understanding some of the risks that are involved if you do not ask some questions up front. So some of these questions may seem obvious, but maybe the risks associated with them if you don't ask those questions are not so obvious. And so it's something that people who are transitioning from a mainly research focus or mainly teaching focus may not be aware of. People who've worked out in industry may already be aware of some of these things, but it has a particular slant when you apply these business concerns to statistical advising. So I'd just like to note that I'm situated in the Arts Education Law Group at Griffith, but I report to all the Dean's research because of this decentralized kind of organisation at the university. I'm also a researcher who works in two research institutes, the Institute of Education Research as well as the Centre for Planetary Health. So that reflects my background both in environmental ecological kind of statistics, as working in the EPA for about 7 years, and the biosecurity CRCs, as well as teaching statistics, and that's why I'm interested in education research, as well as working with education researchers. So I'd like to thank, before we start, I'd like to thank the Stats Society of Australia and the invitation for presenting this workshop to you. It's a wonderful opportunity to have some, to share some of these ideas that have come from, emerged from years of working with beginners, and hope that other people beginning to do stats advising or trying to refine their stats advising may gain from this. So I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we're all meeting, elders past, present and emerging. In the statistical arena, this taking care of Indigenous perspectives is actually an ongoing problem and something we're addressing in some of my projects. I'd also like to thank all the people I've worked with in the past, the clients I've consulted with who may or may not have presented sticky problems or difficult working environments, some of the collaborators and my fellow research methods advisors for helping to refine these questions. So just to get things started, because this is a workshop, so I like to take an active approach to workshops where people don't just sit back passively, but if you actively can and actively engage by typing into the Slack channel or the chat online. So hopefully, Daniela, there's someone from your team has posted the link so people can go directly to the Slack channel in case they've forgotten. So,
yes, there is a link to join the Slack in the chat now.
Good.
And then you can see the channel there.
Yeah, so what I'd like, is if everyone can just answer this question quickly. Who are you and why are you here today? What motivated you to come to this workshop on risky statistical business? That can help shape what I emphasize during today's session. So thanks, Chris. You've said you're in Victoria. It'd be great to know why you're here. Kylie, Chris, and Shi Ching have all posted something, and Pav. But yeah, it'd be great to have just a short phrase on why you're here today. So we've had a few people posting. As a PhD student, you may begin to be sought after for your expertise on stats. So it's good to know upfront some of the things you should be aware of when you do advising. Oh, hello, Lisa. You're coming from New Zealand? Yes, I'm talking in general about risks. I don't think they're specific to the Australian environment. Yeah, so I also work with methods advisors and mixed methods. So these are people who are blending qualitative and quantitative research methods or data science. So these sorts of issues are common across all those sorts of research methods advising. I like that comment, Mark. Yes, often we're advising people who are somewhat reluctant, but they can see the necessity. They've approached you. That's always a good start. That's fantastic. Thank you for everybody typing in there. Okay, so I'll go. And John is, that was a situation I was often in, John. I was the only stats person in the whole organisation when I joined the EPA. And you end up being an advocate for the whole approach. So it's a delicate political situation as well. Okay, so I'll just go back to my slides, but that helps everybody understand who we have in the room and why people are here. Quite diverse. You might like to have a look at my bio. But basically, I've always been balancing consulting with teaching and or research throughout my career, and the things overlap. In fact, my PhD topic arose from a stats consulting problem that was too hard to answer in that kind of time frame. So I came back to academia after some intensive multidisciplinary stats workshops to really refine my stats research. But along the way, it meant I did more advising to different organisations. So as I just mentioned, when working as an advisor on statistics means we often have some of these other roles where we teach techniques or concepts. So at Griffith, we teach a lot of conceptual understanding that's not available in the online teaching, statistical thinking or computational thinking. We might be consulting with people where we just do the stats and don't really explain it to them a whole lot, what we're doing. So those two teaching and consulting can be at opposite ends of the continuum. And then research arises when we need to tweak a method or create a new method in order to answer a research problem adequately. And advising kind of covers all of that background. So depending on your background, everyone has a unique background in teaching, consulting and researching in the data analysis and statistical area. And all of those colour and shape how we do statistical advice in a very specific way. We all bring a very unique perspective and we all have our own strengths and weaknesses. So when we're working with clients or collaborators, they could be at any stage of this life cycle of being an independent researcher in terms of their statistics, who might just touch base with a statistician for peer review, down to someone who's just taking their first steps and needs a lot of help and scaffolding to get along that process. So your stats advising can go from the teaching end to the research or advising end, where people are really just checking in and not requiring so much assistance from you. So the same question can be posed by all of those people, but the answer you provide can be very different. So these questions that you ask up front really help to place the person that you're talking to on this life cycle. Where are they in terms of their dependency on a statistician? How much input do they need from you? So one of the things that I often encounter in the people who are receiving statistical advice is a misunderstanding that there's only one statistical solution. So this quote from Mark Twain, I think, is very useful to keep in mind, that when people ask you how much time do I need to do a statistical analysis, I usually say, well, how long is a piece of string? We can fit the statistical analysis into whatever time frame or set of constraints or practical situation that you have. So I don't think Mark Twain was talking very broadly about statistical analysis, but nevertheless, his idea really does apply. The statistical analysis you undertake can be changed, really be quite different depending on the situation that you're talking into. And so today's workshop is more about figuring out what that situation is, so that then you can tailor your solution to that situation. So we're trying to seek a good fit, if you would like, to use a statistical metaphor, a good fit for your client, not just to solve their problem, because there are many ways to do that, but we're trying to fit in with the way that they think naturally and comfortably, their level of experience. Perhaps they have a desire to develop new skills, perhaps they don't. How open they are to different paradigms, because there are many, and my keynote tomorrow is talking about, I mentioned about 30 that I encounter. So there's many different ways of doing statistical work, and you need to be sort of a bit across that, so that you don't dismiss different perspectives, because they might be valid in different contexts. And then of course there are practical constraints. So the solution that you come up with as an advisor means you need to recognise and be aware of their context, the conventions of statistics in their field, their expectations, and where the cutting edge is at in their field. As a stats advisor, I work across many different fields. And so for me to get into that, these questions help kind of really get there quite across all sorts of different people in a way that's easily, works in all those different contexts. So this is a reminder, it will be in the slides, of the abstract for today. I won't go through it all, but just at the back end of that abstract, I'm just going to be working through some of the questions, and I'll provide anecdotes along the way of how they've worked in real life. I've tried to focus on the power of these questions to help manage or bypass the risky situations before they occur. So this is part of training new research methods advisors or people shifting from a research and teaching focus more to the advising / consulting arena. It's just a guide to help make sure they ask the right questions. And for those of us who are more experienced, sometimes it's a good checklist because you might just forget to ask a certain question because the conversation is flowing. It's a good checklist to make sure you're prepared for your second consult. So this is a set of questions that I tend to ask up front to set the scene. And so everything that I've been talking about till now is talking about the importance of knowing who you're going to be working with here. And that is the beginning of coming up with a solution. So instead of diving into asking about the problem, I start to know who I'm working with first. This involves talking about time, asking about who they are, where they're working, their institutional context, the wider team that they're working within, the resourcing that's available, their view of their first problem that led them to talk to you as a stats advisor, and the preparation that they've already done, which reveals a whole lot about them as someone that you'll be potentially working with. So this is the first stage. I've talked to Daniela about potential for a second workshop, focusing more about the questions you ask to get to know about a particular problem, but this is more setting up to work with a new person, getting to know who they are before you dive in. So today's workshop is starting by getting to know who you're working with, and then a future workshop could dive into the problem and the solution. So to start with, it's very important to understand time. Now, I work with a lot of social and behavioural researchers, environmental and ecological researchers at the moment because I'm at Griffith University. But in the past, I've worked at universities where the quantitative more quantitative fields were more dominant in the physical and biological sciences. So they have slightly different approaches to things. And what I do find is that sometimes I get people who say, I just need a 15-minute meeting, and then you'll be able to tell me what I need to do statistics-wise. And I always say to them, well, I usually just allow an hour chat just to get to understand what your problem is before I dive in with a solution that may be well off base. So one example is where I helped someone when I was a PhD student. I helped them with a problem that they had. I just answered their questions quickly, gave them a solution. But it turned out that one of their presumptions right at the beginning, the model that they were using was completely inadequate to their data. And therefore any of the model diagnostics that I was giving them advice on wouldn't work. So they ended up saying that all my advice was worthless. Really, I should have started with, have you got the model right? Why have you chosen that model? And these model diagnostics are revealing that the model doesn't work. It's not the advice that's the problem. So it's very important to set aside that time at the beginning to manage their expectations that you can give advice in 15 minutes, because in my experience, it's a bit dangerous to try and give advice on your first meeting because it might not take into account some very important assumptions that are in their minds but aren't expressed in that first meeting. You need time to reveal all those hidden constraints. So what I'd like to do is just get you to have a go thinking about from your experience so far in advising, maybe you've been given statistical advice or you've started giving advice to others. What are 4 things that you think are important to spend time on during the first session where you do a stats advisor meets a new potential client? So if you can type that into the Slack channel. Got to find my Slack channel. It keeps disappearing. Might have closed it. I'll have to open up my Slack channel again. Oh no, here it is. It's good. I think the things typed in so far you will find fit into this set of questions. There's a few people talking about the problem, but this is the conversation you have before you get to the research problem. Exactly. Okay, so I think you all have a good idea of some of the things that are important. So it's more about organizing the complete view. So one way to think about the time spent during a consult is that a lot of that time needs to be listening to the client. And in fact, in the first meeting, I may spend most of the time listening to the client and just occasionally probing to understand more about them and their background and the problem. I try to spend very little time in the first meeting doing the problem-solving aspect, except insofar as whether I can help them or not, although that might not be obvious in the first meeting. So listening to the client from the beginning, the best advice I can give to someone who's starting off in their advising career is to resist that temptation to provide a quick statistical solution. It's good to provide them something that they can work on at the end of the meeting, but just try to stop yourself from trying to problem solve from the very beginning. Spend more time listening to them and their needs and probing the problem. In terms of problem solving, there's no just one solution. You have to choose one that's accessible to the client. They have the capacity to deal with it. It's feasible for them to do. It's relevant. And these two things at the bottom, I find most people are not aware of or don't think of. There are different paradigms of doing statistics. So if you have someone who's trained in deterministic or mathematical modeling, and you swing to the other end of the spectrum with a risk assessment, very subjective approach, there are things that they won't understand with that big swing, and they might not even agree that it's appropriate or recognize it as a valuable approach. So understanding where they're coming from helps you choose something that's acceptable. It depends on how open-minded they are, both to the paradigm and also the degree of tweaking you need to do to the method to make it work in their situation. So there's a lot of people who come to us for out-of-the-box kinds of methods. At Griffith, because we have a distributed network of advisors, I tend to be the last resort. So I help out when people are a bit desperate. So they tend to ask me for problems which require a bit of innovation. And straight up, you'll find that if someone comes to you and they don't want that, then it's better to send them off to see someone who gives them an out-of-the-box solution. Now, the way I'm talking about communicating is more like an interview. So you start at the beginning by establishing rapport. A lot of good books on statistical consulting and on interviewing have a lot of good tips on that. Think of it as potentially the first meeting in a collaboration. You need to have good skills in questioning people, probing, fact-checking. So we'll do a quick hands up. How many times has someone said to you that they've done randomized sampling, and then when you probe, you find out it's not randomized? So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about with fact checking. When people are using statistical terminology, they don't always know what they're saying. So you need to come at it from different angles. And then recapping, so reflecting back to them what you understand in what they're saying. Now, most of what I'm talking about today actually falls in this negotiating framework. So throughout the interview, you need time to understand the problem before you dive in to solve it. You need to understand the support they have available and their funding, whether they're in a hurry or they have time to learn new concepts and practice things before they use it, what their desired outcomes are, and someone typed that in. A few of these things people have typed into the Slack. Intellectual property issues, whether they need to own the end result, in which case you might not give your IP on a new method to do something, and the degree of collaboration that they're envisioning, because you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you presume that they're open to collaboration when in fact they're seeing everything that you give as something that they own and take away from that discussion. So just as an overview, what I'm talking about today is not in that problem-solving sort of box. The Stats Consulting Network in the Stats Society often has problem-solving sessions where people get together, share their problems and go through different solutions. I'm talking more about this negotiating end of things, what questions to ask to help offset the risks without that evolves in a natural sort of way. So it's more, I'm focusing more on what questions to ask. And then if you develop your good listening skills and communicating skills, it'll be how you ask those questions. So I'm more focusing on what questions you make sure you ask. And just to remind you, so we've just gone through that time issue, allowing time to find out about the person that you're going to consult with. Are there any questions before I move on to delve into the actual questions, what questions to ask? Any questions from you? Okay. So I'm just rearranging my screen. So when you sit down either in person or online, talking to a new potential client or someone that you might collaborate with, you only have that person in front of you. Sometimes they come with a team. But the first question to ask is, who are they? So I'd like you to think, and this is another Slack exercise, what can go wrong if you're not completely across who the person in front of you is? Seems like an obvious question, but so I'm talking about really, really prosaic things that may seem obvious, but I have encountered people who don't quite get all of these details. So it's a good checklist. It may be obvious to some of you, but stay with me. So the first name of the person you're talking to. So I'm often approached by people first in email, and people from other cultures sometimes write their first name and last name around, you know, in different orders. So it's always good to understand how to pronounce their name, what order their first and last name is in, and acknowledging the culture that they're coming from. Different cultures and languages have different views of mathematics and quantitative analysis and of seeking advice. So one thing I learned was that with some cultures, it's a practice is to nod and say yes. with everything that you might say, but you need to probe to make sure that they've understood what you've said. You can't just take it at face value. Another, it's very important to know who it is you're actually talking to. We have to keep records of who we're talking to, but from a funding perspective, what areas of the university are we supporting? When we're talking with different members within a team, we need to report back to their team leaders about who we've talked with about what. And one of these things that you're learning about, these people are becoming more aware of, is to acknowledge people's prior learning. We have a lot of mature age students at Griffith University, so they often come in with a wealth of experience outside university situations. So just because they're a PhD student doesn't mean they don't have valuable knowledge to bring to the table. And that's all part of, some people know many, many different languages and have worked in many different contexts. So it's understanding who they are as a person. The surname, this seems obvious, but I have worked with someone before who kept their records on first name basis only. It's very important you look up researchers when you first work with them to look at their track record and where they publish, what kinds of things they've done. So having their full name is important. Their position title. Again, this can be useful from a research politics perspective. Maybe you have to use a full title every time you talk to them. It's important to manage expectations. So if someone's a PhD student, but they're already a doctor, it's understanding what their role is when they're approaching you. Now at Griffith, we can provide advice to employees or students, and they have an official Griffith Uni staff or student number, and that governs whether they have access to our services. Otherwise, it's an external consultancy, and if they're an external organisation. So that's important from that perspective. So what we find is that students like to contact you using a personal email, but we try to keep everything through the organisational email, so it's all official. And that just prevents situations from occurring later on where you've given advice to someone who's approached you using their personal email and a name that may or may not be their official name. So you're actually providing services to someone who's not covered by your salary or your position. Now, if you're moving into that collaborative realm, sometimes you might talk to someone to set up a new collaboration, but you still need to know who you're talking to, because there are people who like to walk the system. So I've also actually had someone on this topic of identity. When I've worked in a large centralized stats consulting team, we've had people who like to shop around and meet with several consultants and compare their advice. That's okay, except when you're in a situation where you have limited time available across the consultants and you need to keep records then under each person in a centralized way, or as a method of talking to the stats advisors in that area so that people are aware who they're talking to, because you do have people who try to take advantage of that to get work done. And they get, pushed up the priority list, even though they've already had lots and lots of help from other people. So it's very important to think about how you keep track of who's coming to talk to you, and how you understand who else they've talked to, and whether they actually have access to your advice. So this referral pathway can be very important in handing over people. So if it comes from a trusted source, so we have a researcher education development unit, and they sometimes pass people on to us, or a supervisor might pass someone on to us. That means that people are aware that they're seeking this free service, which is actually underwritten by the whole university. Are there any questions about this this set of questions? How many people already ask those questions when they talk to a new person?
There is a question in Slack, Sama, from Pat.
Oh, okay, I'll have a look. So Pav, that's a really good question. How do you probe their understanding? It's something that happens during the conversation. But I always, when I talk to someone and I meet them for the first time, it's a perfect opportunity to ask where they're from, like what country they're from, where they did their training, just to start fleshing out that detail, where, you know, whether they did a PhD in the Middle East, for instance. I've worked with a PhD student from the Middle East, and their training values being able to repeat what the masters have said. So getting them to innovate requires a lot more encouragement, for instance, or you encourage them to see how they're replicating what someone has done, but with a twist to their own particular environment. And in terms of deciding whether they're just being polite when they say yes, I would upfront just start to try and get them to expand on, you know, not ask those closed-ended questions, but ask them open-ended questions where they have to say more than yes. So do you understand that? And they say yes. It's like, what do you understand by that? Or what makes sense about that to you? Can you explain what you've understood from what I just said? Things like that. Does that answer your question, Pav? Yeah, cool. So with your surname, Pav, I would say, oh, that's an interesting surname. Is that Polish or or have you lived in Australia for a long time, or have you come over recently? Yeah, so you get my gist. It's something that starts at the very beginning when you learn about their name, but it will continue throughout the interview. And yes, Fiona, indeed. Sometimes people come to see me and, you know, for instance, I'm not an expert on sample size determination for clinical trials. So I'll send them off to the Menzies Institute team to do the specific things like that. Yes, Angela, so we put these questions into an online form and get people to fill it out before we organise our first meeting. So it's a good way to make sure, it's a good hurdle to make sure that people really do want your services and they're not going to waste your time, and they have to fill out these details before you see them. Do you have all of these questions in your form, Angela? So did you have the referral pathway? Kind of information? A little bit. So Chris is asking an interesting question about how statistical consults work, what clients you would expect. I think the answer to that is a variety, and it depends on your working arrangement. So I was explicitly employed to do statistical advising, and the parameters of that are to advise researchers at the university. I'm not really there to help people with internal reporting, but if they're trying to learn a method new to them, I might help them with method, but not the actual reporting process, because we employ people to do that. So it's up to you. If you're a PhD student and you're providing advice to people on a fee for service basis, is that what you're talking about, Chris, or are you just providing it as a collaborative kind of thing?
I think the way I'm asking is probably more general, because like, say for your research, you said you do like education and the biostat, like bio medical stuff, I think. So like, who would you normally see? Would you just be, say, I don't know, education advisors need organized on data? I'm just a bit confused on that, because I know you would have to ask people like what their name, surname, position, but I don't know what client you would be expecting and what they're, I don't know, I'm a bit convoluted there, but just.
I think you're actually preempting the next set of questions, where they come from.
Yeah. Oh.
Part of the, yeah. So that's, you're right, coming along with, where the questions are heading next.
Yeah, but that does explain what I was asking.
Yeah. But at different universities, I might be working with more, business people, professions like architects, accountants. Yeah. A corporate environment is quite different to the social and behavioural environment I'm working in now, and I've worked with, biological, physical scientists, quite different clients, different mindsets.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's okay. And Angela's just clarified that yes, you are allowed to speak. It is a workshop, it's not a seminar, and you're doing referrals for hospital researchers, and sometimes people are attending with their kind of the head of the business unit. And so that's really relevant to the wider team questions that I'll come up with in a minute. So that's really useful. Okay, so they're the more obvious questions. It's a really good place to start because they are obvious questions. So if anyone's had experience with designing an interview, you always start with stuff that's easy and flows naturally. And so this is all just part of understanding who you're working with. As we work more and more in the Indigenous statistics realm, if you do a yarn with an Indigenous person, it's very important that you identify who you are and why you're working on that area and why you need to talk to them. So all of this is actually has another layer of importance when you're working in certain contexts, like yarning with Indigenous people. So we're doing a project where we're interviewing Indigenous people at the moment, and this is really pivotal. And if you get it wrong, then you can set people offside at the very beginning. So that's why I'm mentioning this, and perhaps it may seem very obvious, but it takes on another level of importance when you're working in these other contexts. So I just wanted to emphasize that, yeah, statistics advising, and especially the first meeting, is more about listening. And I thought this quote from Rhonda Britton was useful for this context, because even though people might, most of the people I talk to are genuine, they may be misinformed, but that's not their fault. But you listen to them as though they are telling you, what the truth is. They're not trying to gameplay you. Always ask questions to clarify what they mean if that's not obvious to you. And the way I get around that is I say I work with people in many different disciplines. And as you can imagine, I'm not an expert on how statistics is used in that particular discipline or context. And so that's why I'm going to ask you what appear to be very silly questions. And that's an important skill, I think, especially I found that early career researchers don't realise that they don't have to be the expert and know everything. Okay, so it's very important to get them to clarify in their own words how statistics is perceived in their discipline. And they may have very different values about statistical techniques compared to you. So this is where an inclusive approach to statistical paradigms can become useful. Every statistical paradigm has its positives and negatives. And so we just try to match them up with something that will meet their needs. So, I've worked with people who've had very bad experiences sometimes in providing advice to people, and then they become a bit suspicious. But it's very important not just to get your potential clients to talk about facts, but also to start telling you the story that's driving them to look at these facts, because this fiction or the story that they're putting around the numbers is very important. It helps you understand what their values are and where they're coming from. So that's just the first phase of understanding who you're talking to. And as Chris was thinking ahead, part of who they are is where they came from. So understanding their background really, really shapes their advice. So I'd like you to just have a chance of brainstorming, putting into the Slack again, what do you think you need to know about their background? And a few people have already answered that when I asked, who are they? So this is just for people who didn't already provide some insight on that. Not seeing anything pop up yet, but it says that several people are typing, so that's good. It's encouraging. Yes, statistical training is pivotal. So most of the people we see have had Stats 101. Not much else. Some people come in with 3 statistics subjects. Some people tell me, oh, I stopped listening to maths at school in grade 3 or grade 5 or grade 8. So it's important to understand when they disconnected from maths, and then, you know, what fears they have around the maths and their stats come to talk to you. Technical capability is very important in terms of what software they use. We cover that. I cover that more in the second workshop on, because it's relevant to the problem, what software. Yes, understanding if someone's asking you a tutorial question, of course, you don't want to be giving them the answer. You want to be helping them to find the answer. That's very important. How many people have been caught out by students wishing to get the answer to an assignment out of a stats advisor? That's happened to me before. They're very tricky. Yes, hierarchy is very important when you work with people in government. Daisy, I worked in the EPA for 7 years, and sitting on people's desks and talking to them allows you to see who they're actually working with and what the hierarchy is compared to how it might come across on paper as well. Working knowledge about the research topic I really address at the end of this session. That's very important. Yes, and their role in the project. So Angela's talking about their team role. Excellent. Okay, so in terms of checklist, I think you've almost covered it off, but their degree is part of their experience. For us, that helps situate their research interests and their prior statistical exposure. So for me, it's very important in understanding if they've come from a qual or quant dominated culture, that will set them up to understand statistics in very different ways. So I've actually found since working at Griffith that qualitatively trained researchers are much more used to having a multiple choice of many different methods, and they will dedicate a whole year to developing a new survey because they want to get the theory, conceptual framework, validate the instrument, and then do the analysis. They give themselves a whole year, but students in other disciplines who are more quantitatively trained may not allocate that amount of time, and they may not be interested in some of the philosophical things that go on behind the scenes, the theory or the conceptual framework. So understanding where they're coming from will also shape your advice. You don't want to be advising a very pragmatic quant-trained person to spend a lot of time theorizing. They'll get frustrated. So it's very important to situate what they're interested in because that affects your understanding of what their problem really is, the need, the values that people hold in that field and the context, so the discipline and statistical conventions. So I've worked with someone who was a student in education whose supervisors who were very strongly qualitatively trained, but it turned out the students' values were quite different, very pragmatic, not very interested in a lot of the advice that was being given when the initial meetings were being driven by the supervisors. And so you end up with a conflict of interest then, and it takes much more time to untangle what they're really going to do. And you have to set up small tasks to really check whether they're inspired to go down that route, as a way of checking whether they really want you give them a reading. Just read this paper on this approach. If they don't do it, then they're not really interested in, you know, that aspect, theorizing or conceptualizing what's going on. Stats training came up, and it's not just, you know, the name of the course, because if you do a course on statistical modeling, you need to hear from them what that course covered. So our courses on statistical modeling talk more about the thinking involved and differentiating Bayesian, frequentist and null hypothesis testing. But if they've only done statistical modeling from ordinary least squares in an environmetric and a econometrics context, they'll be more used to doing a law-based derivation of a method. So that background is very important. And yeah, paradigm is also very important, because if you're talking to a quant person about a qual paradigm or vice versa, you could be setting them offside. And then someone mentioned that you need to know if you're talking to a student. There are lots of things to be aware of when you're giving advice towards a research dissertation. So pulling that out in your initial question is very important. Understanding if you're working with an international or domestic student is very important, because they have very different time pressures and different motivations. You want to make sure your advice is at the right level. So I can't understate the importance of statistical paradigm. We're no longer in a situation as we were when I was just starting out as a stats advisor, where we assumed everyone was doing null hypothesis testing because software at the time was able of doing that. These days we have data science, Bayesian, frequentist, mathematical modeling, all manner of things, which I go through in my talk tomorrow. Any questions so far? Just check the Slack. Okay. So as I think Angela made a comment about the wider team. So it's not just who you're talking to in front of you, it's who's around them who will shape the project. So I've worked in a team where things have gone terribly wrong before. I wasn't actually the consultant, so I'll make the details a bit general so you can't trace back who it was. But I've worked with someone who was fairly new in their stats advising career, providing advice to someone. They basically, the person they were talking to had written up their PhD, presuming that the data would be showing something. And the stats analyst showed that the data showed the exact opposite. The client didn't agree with the advice, and it got escalated to the very top levels, you know, up to head of school, head of department, head of faculty, to the vice chancellor, deputy vice chancellor, all because there was a disagreement. And part of what this new stats advisor did, and I was fairly new at the time too, they didn't really communicate with anyone other than that very strong-willed person. And so it can be very helpful to involve the whole team from the outset, because it's not then just you managing these expectations, and also involving your boss when things get sticky. Whoever is senior to you can also help negotiate when these things go wrong, so that it doesn't escalate to the very top levels. So you don't want to be learning from experience. You want to be acknowledging the wider team up front. On the flip side of that, I've also seen where engaging the whole team can be problematic because there was a difference in paradigms. They were working with people who are very anti-Bayesian, And the stats consultant, who shall not be named, came up with a Bayesian approach, which worked very well. They checked the traditional approach, which did not work well and hid what was going on. But again, they tried to, it was very difficult to push that through. And in fact, because the rest of the team members were away for about 6 months, it gave them time to develop that argument and demonstrate that the Bayesian approach was working. But then negotiating when the team came back became very difficult. So it can be useful to include other people to help you champion and support you when you provide statistical advice. So setting up your own wider team can be very, very helpful. Otherwise, you can end up in those difficult situations. So they're just two examples that have gone wrong, with people that peers that I worked with when I was young in my experience. What do you think you need to know about the person's organisational context? So we've had a couple of suggestions, but it'd be good if you could think of a few other things that might come up. So Daisy mentioned the hierarchical working relationships. And Angela mentioned consultants attending with registrars. Yes, Fiona, so how much freedom they have to make decisions. It's very delicate. So this isn't covered here in my questions, Fiona, but one thing I do about that is where others are giving them advice, I ask them to write down one reference to support their advice. So I might be working with someone who says, oh, my supervisor thinks that I should be using X, Y, Z. I'll say, oh, can you ask them for one reference to help support that choice of method in this context? And that often they can't find one. They might be married to a technique, but they don't have a relevant reference to support them. So I've actually found that helps in that situation. Yeah, Tana, it is a very helpful technique. I didn't put it in these slides, so I'll have to add it. Yes, Angela, it can be very helpful to have supervisors present at the first meeting, although in practice, I think it's about 50-50 with me. Usually the student just presents the initial problem until I have a good enough view of things, and then we might bring in the supervisor. So that's with people, because we have a lot of mature age learners, often they can run their own kind of agenda, but others, sometimes the supervisor insists on being present, and other times they're just too busy. So especially in the last few years, we're finding that, sometimes they're not there until the third meeting, but it is good to have an early meeting with the supervisor present, unless you have a clash of concerns, in which case the student's in a difficult position and might be reconsidering their team. And Annie, who they report to, is very important. So when I worked in the CRC for biosecurity, it was very important who the projects were funded by and who was being reported to, because that would shape how you would wrap up the results. Okay, so here's what I put in the oven pre-prepared before you came up with your ideas. So we asked about, at Griffith, it's an academic group, so at other universities it could be a faculty, and in some organisations it's a division. So you need to know what funding they have, or what access, they may have access to some funding that they can apply for. That shapes whether you can get them more help. If they can't rely on you to do the analysis, you're just advising them on how to go about it, they might need a lot more help. So it's very important to understand what their funding possibilities are. And again, if you know where they're from in the university, that can help shape your understanding of their interests and access to statistical support. And for us, we have to report by academic group on who's using our services. And managers of these areas like to know how many people are accessing your help. It just helps them to judge how things are going. So at Griffith, it was part of an ongoing experiment in how you provide statistical advice. They tried a few traditional measures, but we had now settled on this decentralized approach. Getting down to the actual school or research center or unit or team gives you a much clearer idea of the team that they work in. And this is where you end up with those clashes of paradigms. If you don't know who it is that they're talking to, I've recently begun giving advice to 3 students, and it turned out they were being supervised by the same supervisors in the same research team. And that meant we could come up with a more proactive approach to teaching them about a certain class of statistical model going forward. So instead of addressing the problem with each person individually, we're now going to be training the whole team in some conceptual understandings to help them transition, because their field didn't have a lot of statistics in it, and they're diving into quite intermediate level statistics. They need a new pathway that's doesn't require them to do 4 mathematical courses. And if you know the team that they're in, if you know how active that group is in attracting new grants, that sort of thing, and then you will approach the idea of how they build in that funding for better statistical help. It gives you an idea of how innovative they're willing to be with their statistical techniques. And then who they're the overarching director again shapes the culture. At Griffith, we have something called a higher degree research student convener, who is someone that came out of, this is a long story, but I'll just take a little detour here. Before I came on board, they had a stats advisor who took records of what sort of advice he was providing, and it came out that about 80% of his advice was helping people from research teams that were dysfunctional. And so they set up this format where you have HDR conveners, academics who are people that the HDRs, the PhD students, master's students can talk to. They're an intermediary to help with dysfunctional supervisory relationships. And so these people are very key to who we keep up to date with in terms of overall resourcing and training in their area. This helps manage the risk where you end up with someone coming to you and they've got hardly any support around them, and they end up relying solely on you as a statistical advisor, which can be a very time-hungry kind of relationship. So it's part of building their network, not just your network around you to help them, but how do you support them to be able to carry out the new statistical analysis? So it's putting them in touch with another peer group, you know, in a totally different part of the university. Perhaps bringing on a supervisor to their team who is from some other area in the university who can help them with their take on a new method. And then, yes, the reporting arrangements are very important. There's a lot of politics. You need to understand the research ethics in terms of who's got access to the data, if you're allowed to look at the data as a stats advisor, or if you can only look at exemplar data, whether there are IP agreements in place. So we've had a couple of disputes over the years where people took statistical advice and didn't acknowledge it. So I think the Stats Society has come up with a example statement on how statistical contribution should be acknowledged. So I encourage you to have a look on the website for that. And understanding who they're reporting to is important for managing conflicts in whether students are actually taking advice on. So We've had one example, luckily, in all my years of advising, where a student was sitting in meetings saying, yes, I'll do that, yes, I'll do that, not doing anything. And after a certain period of time, it becomes obvious that you're providing advice and they're not acting on it. So it's you bring in the team leader to try and resolve that, whether you just leave the team because they don't need your advice or wish to do any statistics. So it's just better to be talking with the head of the team in there, because that can govern your time as well as theirs. It also keeps things real to make sure you're not giving advice to do something too complicated beyond the resourcing that they'd like. And as I said before, having a peer group is really important for the person you're advising. So understanding who else they have access to, whether they have regular seminars with their group, if you can put them in contact with other people addressing similar problems so that they're not trying to take on new statistics or statistics that's new to them on their own. And again, understanding who the other team members are is important for managing potential conflicts in advice where you just have different opinions. So being aware of who's on the team is very important. Okay, yep.
So just letting you know, there is one question there, but we are in the schedule have a break now, if that fits with the...
Yeah, I was just thinking it's getting a bit, I'm talking a lot, so I might take a break after I've answered the question. Intervening in dysfunctional teams. Yeah, so I don't think it's our job as statistical advisors to intervene, but you can put people in contact with people who are there to support them if they do have a dysfunctional team. So often students are not even aware that they have rights, that they can choose who is on their supervisory team. They may opt to continue with the same team, but choose a way forward that doesn't stimulate conflict. So sometimes, and when I worked in government, we might report credible intervals in a way that looked very similar to the reporting of confidence intervals and put the technical details in the appendix. And then that would go past certain people in management who were not aware of or not open-minded enough, but still satisfy the technical people's need to make sure they got an answer in situations where the traditional confidence intervals just couldn't be calculated. So there are, different ways you can support people, but you should try not to do it. You should try to use all of the resources that are already available to students. So that means being aware of how can students be supported if their team is dysfunctional. So at Griffith, we have HDR conveners, we have high degree research student advocates, so they're for the student. We have the student guild. We actually have the head of the school or the institute. So there's many different paths. So hopefully the statistician is really just guiding them towards those paths. And that's a good point, Angela, that you take on a lot of responsibility in guiding someone who's young in their research career. And that's why getting to know them first, where they're trying to go with their career, what they want, what their priorities are, is very important. So you don't just dive in and assume that they're going to have an out-of-the-box solution. Thank you. Shi-Ching came up with the direct link to the statement on co-authorship as it involves statisticians. And that's a lot of work that the Stats Consulting Network and the Stats Society has been working on for many months, maybe longer than that. Okay, so we might just have a little break so that you're not listening to me. Before we go on the break, I'll just leave you one thing to think about. Perhaps this is a good point at which to come up with mismatches between teams and the person you're advising. If you have any specific examples that you'd like to talk through, that's where some of the challenges can be. And so these questions are helping to understand who you're working with, but then what do you do I could possibly, come back from the break with some examples there if you'd like to pursue it.